Okay, thanks for everybody for coming. This is my DevCon talk. Unfortunately, I couldn't join you guys for that fun week. I heard a lot of really great talks were given. So this is mine. This is kind of like a makeup. And for those of you who are joining after the fact to watch the recording, hopefully we did a good job doing that. So this is the title of my talk. The web is HTML, drinking the Progressive Enhancement Kool-Aid. As most of you or some of you may or may not know, I swing that sword with a pretty wide arc. I'm kind of a really conservative when it comes to progressive enhancement and HTML techniques. So I was thinking that I would share some of what I do in that respect with everyone else. So as far as introductions, for those of you who don't know me, hi, I'm Clint. I'm a senior software architect and web evangelist. I'm working with semantic search and a number of other teams on web techniques. I'm extremely passionate about accessibility, semantics, agnostics, what I refer to as agnostics, and beautiful web design as well as beautiful code. So just a few rules of the road here. I think Kevin will be floating around at some point, but I've made no assumptions of skill level here. So some of you maybe have been writing web code here since the web experience. Some of you may just be interested in it. I've made no assumptions whatsoever. And so I want you to interrupt. Just shoot your hand up in the air, and that's fine. Just ask away. I want to make this as much of a discussion as it is a presentation, and I definitely want to talk about this more afterwards. For those of you who haven't yet joined the web developers group or the web designers group on Cerner, I highly recommend it. Some really good discussions going on in there, and we can use as many people as we can. So the first thing I want to talk about is a bit of history, because where we are depends on where we were. In the beginning, there were just tags. I've been doing web development for quite some time. My first website was written in a notepad. There was no such thing as CSS. There was no such thing as JavaScript. Java applets were too new. I had to write everything in CGI scripts in the back end. But the important thing was tags meant something. There was this really great bare bones guide to HTML that was going around back in 95, 96 that described every tag and what it meant. Because the web was HTML. And for those of you who don't know, HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And the reason they called it that is because it was derived from a feature within HyperCard, which is some type of document. I've never seen it personally, but I've heard a lot about it. And it was proposed as part of the World Wide Web by Tim Berners-Lee as a means for Cerner scientists to communicate and share data. A web page was a document of annotated text. You would take a normal document of text and you would add tags around individual data elements to indicate what they were. And a website was simply a collection of pages. And so if you were writing a research paper and you wanted to say, I'm referencing this particular paper, you would mark it up with an anchor and it would send you over and you could see that specific block of text that the person was referring to. It was very, very powerful, but of course it spread like wildfire and things were good, right? So documents became very, very rich. What used to be, just a thing you would print off and hand to somebody else actually became very, very meaningful. Every tag had a meaning, and there was a meaning for every portion of content. There was never any floating text around for the most part. And user agents, which were browsers, search engines, screen readers, could scan that content and apply meaning to that content in whatever way it wanted. So right now, the most common user agent today that we all work with are web browsers. But that wasn't the only means of interpreting that HTML document. And so this is my infamous grocery list example when it comes to HTML. This is the example I always like to use. If I stood up here and I read off my grocery list to all of you, and I asked you to get out a pen or pencil and a piece of paper and write down my grocery list, I can guarantee a lot of them would look alike, but a lot of them would also be different. In some cases, somebody would write it with a blue pen. Some people would write it with a red pen. Some people would write it with checkboxes next to each item in a list. Some people might do a comma-delimited list if it was a short list. So the point is that your content, in this case my grocery list, is marked up in a meaningful manner. In this case, a header and an unordered list of items, because it doesn't really matter what order I get the items in. And then the presentation of that markup can vary. I can say, I want the font type to be a certain way, and I want them to, not have bullets and make the items blue, and in some cases I want them in a straight list with a pipe in between. It really doesn't matter. The point is, it's still my grocery list, no matter how I make it look. And this is the essence behind semantic markup. And things were good, and then things had to get sexy, right? It wasn't enough just to have regular documents. We wanted better websites. Demand across the web rose, and documents alone weren't sufficient. Images started creeping into the fore, more than just figures, but actual colors and richness. Users wanted the richer experience, and we as authors, we wanted better tools to provide that experience. And so some really smart people started developing new technologies to make this possible. Cascading style sheets, JavaScript, Flash, and even Java at the time. And part of that intention wasn't just to make richer websites for the users, but it was also to make markup richer. And then we had the great, what I call the build rush, right? The web started getting really, really neat. Suddenly everybody was building websites. Suddenly there was an explosion. And that explosive growth, we kind of sidetracked a little bit. We got caught up in the what does it look like and how does it function. Some would argue we got sidetracked quite a bit. Complexity of these documents increased, and there was a huge influx of authors. And not just, and one of the beautiful things about HTML is that you didn't have to be a programmer to write a website. As long as you understood the basic concepts, you could write your own website. And the trouble was people started thinking about what do I want my website to say, and what do I want it to look like, rather than what is the actual site. As long as I could copy and paste code into the page and make it look the way I wanted it to look, then that was sufficient. And then what you see is what you get. The WYSIWYG editors. Dreamweaver is one of the last remaining remnants of that WYSIWYG movement, kind of descended into the web. And this is what I call my $48,000 guilty verdict. This is the very first website I ever wrote. It was a website on Shakespeare. It's awful. It's really, really ugly. But this was 1996. So it's a table-based layout, lots of images. Like I said, we weren't actually able to use any form of JavaScript, or CSS didn't even exist. We would use tables to lay out what it looked like. And as a matter of fact, we were required to have a text-based version only because Lynx was still a very popular browser at the time. So, and from this was a website that was entered in a competition that we actually placed second place in and got scholarships for. So it was really cool. But look, every now and then I look back on this and think about how ugly things were back then. But as it always does, innovation continued at a very rapid pace, just as quickly as the web was growing. And a lot of us panicked. The browser wars started up, and things started looking very, very different between each browser. Suddenly Web 2.0, as they called it, kind of came onto the web. And then we had a myriad of devices enter the fore. So, and this happened very, very quickly. But the devil's in the details. And so I remember going to SIGGRAPH in 2003, and there was this talk of graceful degradation, progressive enhancement, terms I hadn't really heard before. And when the web got very, very deep, web competition became that new hotness. It wasn't just enough that you had a website. Your website had to be the #1 search result. I thank Google for this. Your website had to be the #1 search result. You had to get ahead of your competitors, and search engines became that key to being found, being noticed, and beating your competitors to your customers. And so we had this term SEO, search engine optimization. And what's funny about SEO is basically a whole lot of people came into the marketplace saying, I can get your website to the top of search results without you having to change anything. So this website that you developed that can look awesome, or that already looks awesome, I can make it to the top. And what do? They inserted meta tags in the top of the page. And they wanted you to have really sexy titles so that when Google indexed your site would pop to the top. And then we had this web renaissance at South by Southwest. Authors began looking at their markup very, very closely. What exactly am I writing? Why is Google and other search engines placing my site where it is? And the reason for that was because Google is a siteless user agent, right? It doesn't look at your CSS. It doesn't look at what it looks like. What it focuses on is what is it? And not just the text, but what importance have you given that text with a specific tag? And so these terms, graceful degradation, progressive enhancement, and then even accessibility started coming into everyone's terminology. And what it looked like began to matter less and less and less, because you could have the sexiest site in the world and still never be indexed on Google. Someone could always beat you. And then HTML5 came around. And HTML5 has kind of become a term synonymous with a lot of things, not just the tags and not just the new features we have in browsers, but HTML5 has come to mean the new CSS features we have, new JavaScript features we have, new media queries, and all these really, really sexy things that make our jobs a lot easier. And I think what's also, just in case people aren't aware, it's no longer called HTML5. It's actually just referred to as HTML now. They've declared the HTML5 spec a living document that will continue to be edited on the fly. So the next time you're at a geek party, don't refer to it as HTML5. And so this is a point that I kind of came to. There are some really awesome sites on the web today. And if how it works and how it looks mean everything, the user experience means everything, then why is everyone so excited about HTML5? Because the way they designed HTML5 was they went and they did this really great survey. I need to post it on the web developers group, but they did a really great survey. They actually surveyed, I think, some huge number of websites. And they took and they looked at all the class names and elements that were being used on some of the best designed websites. And they noticed that more often than not, you had a div with class header, and you had a div with class header group, and you had a div with class article, and you had a div with class sidebar. And so those are the elements they made. They didn't make elements specifically for these new form controls. They actually looked at what some of the best web developers were doing and some of their most common class names and created new tags to represent them. And why did they do that? It wasn't to save developers from typing class equals. It was actually to apply new semantic meaning to the documents we write and to the websites we write. And so we've kind of come full circle and have rediscovered that markup really is everything. And this is the point that I drive home with every website I build, that the CSS and the JavaScript and any other what I refer to as bolt-on to your website really don't matter. What really matters is your markup. So how powerful is markup? This is one of my favorite examples. This was in 2003 at South by Southwest. Douglas Bowman, I'm sure some of you are familiar with that name. He founded Stop Design, and he was at Google, and I believe now he's at Twitter. Had this really great story that really struck home with me. He redesigned Wired.com, I think in 2003, 2004. And he gave a talk called The Beauty of CSS-Based Design. And at the end, he said, you know, when you launch a new website, oftentimes they give the attribution to who redesigned it. In this case, they gave him the credit, and he started getting lots and lots of emails from people. And it was all, I love this, I love that, this is what I love that you did, and this is what I think you should do. And he said they were all pretty much the same, but he got to one that started off the same way. But at the bottom, it said, it's really great to be able to read your website, and by the way, I'm blind. So that, for me, became much more important than any CSS style sheet I could ever write. What became important was how was the browser, and any user agent for that matter, interpreting the documents I was putting out on the web. But it's more than that as well. Sometimes markup can take a joke well past its intended lifespan. This is a website I wrote for my birthday last year. Long story short, I had a bus pick people up at random bars, and I called it Going Back to Elementary School. And so I wrote this website, and I even wrote a quick permission slip for people to be able to say what bus stop they wanted to be picked up at. Now, the thing is, I had some friends be teachers, and as a joke, they gave me a picture and what they wanted to be, and I wrote them a bio. About 2 months after I wrote this, I didn't index this, I didn't put it anywhere, I just put it out on the web, and there were only links from Facebook. Facebook was the only, and Twitter were the only two websites linking to this webpage. I got a phone call 3 months after my birthday from a friend of mine, and she said, I just did a Google image search for myself. And the ridiculous picture that I sent you is the #1 picture on Google. And if you click it, it goes to that ridiculous web page you wrote. Could you please take it down? And I got to thinking about that, and that's amazing. That beat out her Facebook picture. It beat out, and why did it beat out all those pictures? Because of the way Google's algorithm is written, certainly. I mean, because there's a link coming from Facebook and there's a link coming from Twitter, and it starts to index the site. But there was no meta tag in this page. It was a plain HTML page with just a little bit of CSS. The reason it got indexed that way was because there was an H3 header with her name, and immediately following was a paragraph with a class image and an image inside it. And it was smart enough to know that that was a picture of her. So anyway, the point of that story is markup is extremely, extremely powerful, more powerful than you might expect. The other thing I want to say regarding accessibility, and this is something that I think a lot of you have heard me say before. The definition of web accessibility in Section 508, which is the government standard we all have to follow for any website that is used by someone who's disabled. Technology is considered accessible if it can be used as effectively by people with disabilities as by those without. And I want to expand that a little bit, and I want to be able to say, as well as by those with less than modern means. So not everyone has the latest, greatest browser, and not everyone can update to the latest and greatest browser. And you have people in rural areas who are starting to get exposed to the internet. And I'm sure that considering their speeds, they might want to use Lynx as their web browser, as crazy as that sounds. But you also have devices that aren't on 4G. And sometimes we write software that has to be accessed immediately on a very slow connection. And we have to make sure that those devices are at least capable of seeing our site. It may not be whiz-bang, but they have to at least be able to use it. So let's get down to it. What do I mean when I say web agnostics? This is a term that I don't know if anyone else uses it, but I use it. Web agnostics means that term of accessibility, writing a website that will work everywhere. I hate the status quo today. Websites like, or companies like Google and Facebook and even Twitter to a certain extent, just build a mobile site. I find that personally ridiculous. If the HTML was solid, you wouldn't have to necessarily build a mobile site. You may decide to write a mobile site, but if I hit it from my WAP phone, I shouldn't hit a completely different experience. And because Facebook is so spread out and trying to give a custom user experience with custom code for every platform, they're stumbling. Facebook right now just recently launched their iPad app, their official iPad app that's going to solve all these complaints people are having about using the mobile site on their iPad. And they have different experiences based on different devices. So a common complaint, I noticed that, okay, put it to you this way. The website is probably their richest experience. It's the one that we use most often, some of us. And what I notice is the apps that are written for the different devices, BlackBerry, WebOS, Android, and iOS, the amount or the number of features that are included from the main website is almost completely on par with the popularity of that device. So iPhone right now has the most functionality with taking photos. They even have, like, I don't know if you guys have seen the prototypes of taking photos and posting them to your feed. WebOS has the weakest experience. The only thing you can do is really see the feed and maybe publish a photo. And so people who moved between and went from Android to WebOS complained bitterly about the lack of features in WebOS. So this is what I dislike. It really, people who are on a specific device that you haven't thought of, that you haven't given credence to, based on statistics of, oh, you know, that's only 3% of my traffic is WebOS, I'm really not going to worry about it. You know, those complaints can be bitter, especially in a world today with Twitter. So web agnostics is about being the web. It's the practice of building sites that function identically in every user agent. And I'm not talking about JavaScript and CSS. Forget that part. I'm talking about just the HTML. It strives to isolate the differences between each device or experience to the layers beyond the markup. What do I mean by that? I mean that if I'm on iPhone, I still download the same raw HTML, but I customize that HTML with JavaScript and CSS to create the experience I want on that device. And it relies on a very strict progressive enhancement philosophy. And for those of you who aren't familiar with progressive enhancement, it's the concept of, it's what I'm talking about, it's the HTML, then layering on CSS, and then layering on JavaScript. And treating each layer as separate. And it can be very powerful. These are a few examples of prototypes I've written while here at Cerner. This is called DocBox. It was just a prototype that wasn't really real. It was just pure HTML. And this is the same HTML being bootstrapped with different CSS and JavaScript. And in most cases, people couldn't tell on the iPhone that it wasn't actually an app. Another example, this was activity tracking that we did. It was real in the back end, but we actually had different experiences for different devices. iPhone had a really rich experience that was very similar to the actual web version. And you can see up here in the upper right, the BlackBerry version with no CSS and no JavaScript whatsoever. But you can still see your weight, your total weight, your last blood pressure, your last height. I did a demo of this at the Sprint campus. And I asked for the oldest device in the room, the oldest they could find. And I got handed the worst phone I'd ever seen in my life. And I loaded up activity tracking and my personal health record live on that phone and could scroll down and see my last reading, etc. A big amount of props to the Cerner Health folks and their personal health record. This is probably one of the most advanced sites I've seen at Cerner that actually does something very similar to what I'm talking about already, where based on the size of your device or whatever detection methodology they decide to use, gives you the same amount of functionality in a different package. It's really, really impressive. So if you want to see a good example, I would go look at those guys. But let me make a caveat. I'm not saying that presentation supersedes workflow. A lot of times, rearranged workflow may preempt the ability to reuse markup. Ryan Niemeyer came up with a really great example that I like to use, which is if you're citing a medication for a patient, you're trying to decide on a medication for a patient. The normal workflow is to have the patient in context already and do all the different alert checking and dosage checking that you would normally already do during the workflow. But on a mobile device, it may be better to choose the medication first and then do all those checks at the end. It would be faster. That's an example of a workflow difference that is a great argument for not reusing the same code for different experiences. But you should always question whether or not it's really a good argument or not. I would argue that this type of workflow difference is rare. But I would love to be proven wrong. Okay, so why? Why should we do this? Why should we strive to create a web-agnostic experience at Cerner? There's a lot of examples out on the web of people not working well in multiple environments. So if a blog post has ever been tweeted to you and you click on it inside your iPhone, and instead of going to the article, it takes you to the home page of the mobile site, right? That's just poor detection logic, but that's my point, is that a lot of times people just assume, well, you're looking at it on your mobile device, you know where you're going. But then there's also the Facebook problem, which is how many versions of a website do you want to maintain at once? Is all that content coming out of a single database, or do you have multiple? Do you have connections around? And have you want to maintain source code for all those different versions? But also, flexing that skin is extremely cheap and extremely easy once you get really familiar with JavaScript and CSS, of course. Anecdotally, I haven't done any analysis, really. My code variance between skins is a very small portion of the overall code base. That DocBox example I showed you was literally 50 lines of JavaScript and probably 150 lines of CSS for iPhone, and then I did something similar for desktop. So, and it didn't take me very long. It took me 1 day, 2 days tops to make that experience happen. But what's really neat is discarding those skins means not having to start over. If you don't like the iPhone experience, throw the skin away. You don't have to throw the site away. And you don't have to piecemeal in new parts. And you already have all the functionality that you've already written And plus, if a new device launches, you decide what skin experience you want to send, if any at all. You can still send that pure HTML experience until you write that version. And if you want to help kill IE6, I love that image. If you want to help kill IE6, stop going around saying, we're not going to support it anymore. I think that's silly. Telling someone they can't use a browser is silly. But giving them a plain HTML site where they can still do everything that they want to do, just not sexy, is a great way to get them to update their browser. In most of my personal websites, and even in the activity tracking prototype, if you load it up in IE6, you got a plain HTML experience. And we would argue, you can still see your weight. You can still click links and still move down and still see everything. What's your problem? Well, I'm used to the drop-down. Okay, we'll get a better web browser, and then you can see that. But just saying we don't support a web browser basically is saying we only support a subset of user agents. And that's not the web. At least that's my opinion. Okay, so it's all cool. So how do we do this? And so what I've done is I've put together a few examples. But the first thing you do is you write a rock-solid foundation. And HTML is that foundation. You need to study and understand tags and their meanings. What do they really mean? It's set the visual aside. I'll talk about that in a minute. And use tags properly. What are you trying to say? If you were handing someone an XML document, right? If you were sending someone an XML feed and you open it up, as an engineer, you want to know, you want meaningful tags. You want to know what that stuff is. But for some reason in HTML, we don't hold ourselves to the same standard. We should be able to send someone an HTML page and look at it in source and know what it is without having to load it up in a web browser. We really should. And you need to disconnect what it looks like, its style, and focus on what it is, its content. So what I like to say is HTML is a skeleton that deserves a really sexy skin. So you've got this really great rock-solid foundation. Now, what are you going to do with it? You need to treat CSS, JavaScript, Flash, everything else, not as constants in the environment, but as bolt-on technology, because that's what they are. We take advantage of the fact, we take for granted that JavaScript is always going to be there. And we kind of joke around about, oh, turn JavaScript off and does it work? And oh, that's a great feature. It's not a feature, at least in my opinion. JavaScript was invented to make the web better, but it is not the web. So the web worked without those technologies, and it still can. And every single web device, whether it's the dashboard in your car to the most fangle-dangled iPad you can find, at its core has to parse HTML. It can't be a web browser if it doesn't. So your site will always work if you have a solid skeleton underneath. And every experience you want to create with that markup is just layering on to that HTML structure. And then you go ahead and start writing your skins, or 2, or 3, or 4, however many you want to write. And I know CSS and JavaScript, I've heard it all the time, are scary. They vary between browsers. The good news is they're starting to stabilize. But the existence of frameworks like jQuery, YUI, etc., demonstrate the fact that people find CSS and JavaScript scary. And you just want to decide what you want the site to look like in which context. You start with a desktop skin, and you be patient with yourself playing around in other environments, because your site is done already. Once you have that HTML, your site is done. All you're doing now is making it look and function better for the user. And then what I like to say is choose a fulcrum. There's a lot of tools out there with the ability to allow you to flex what CSS and what JavaScript is applied to your documents. Some of my favorites are Yep, Nope, and Has.js. Some really powerful feature detection. It doesn't try to be anything more than that. Modernizer, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Modernizer. It has feature detection, and it actually adds class names to the HTML element to allow you to know what it's capable of. Use this with caution. I've seen sites throw every single capability that they have into the HTML element, which causes reflow in the page. And also, no matter how many class names you put on the HTML element, you're still downloading all the code for CSS to be able to determine what you can see and what you can't. So Some of the built-in stuff that's coming down the pipeline are media queries and conditional comments. It's kind of out of scope for this talk, but there's a lot of things. And then we have the Cerner Web Bootstrapper, which I wrote a couple of years ago, which is coming into a new version. It's currently in Java, and it's been ported over to Ruby on Rails, or just create your own. And there really are a lot of possibilities. It just depends on your individual use case. So this is an example of web agnostics that I want to use, and this is a prototype that I wrote of the UCern video site a year and a half ago. And I kind of wanted to demonstrate to the UCern team things that could be done semantically. So what I like to refer to this as is designing markup based on a visual. So you start by completely ignoring color and position and all those things. You just kind of take a step back and look at it and try to decide what these items are. So in this case, I always start with my headings. I have a video title, about this video, and comments. Those are the headings that I can see right now. And ignore their size in the visual. Just because they're a certain size doesn't indicate their importance. About this video and comments are probably on the same level below the video title, even though they may be different sizes. Then you start looking at navigation and listings. So I start identifying unordered lists and ordered lists. Again, ignoring what they look like. Just because you have a series of links with a pipe in between doesn't mean it's not a list of links. And then I start identifying my data blocks using definition lists, paragraphs, headed sections, blocks of information that I need to make meaningful. So let's start with this about this video block. And it's a data block that contains details about the video. And note that just by looking at it, you can infer right away all the different data points, right? So we already know how long it is, how long ago it was posted, how many likes and how many comments it has, who posted it and when. But the thing is, that's just text. So to a machine, that means nothing. But to us, we can see it and we know what it means. So you start by identifying your markup. In this case, I love definition lists. It's a very rarely used tag, but it basically organizes data into key value pairs. Even if those names, the keys, aren't visible to the browser. So you can kind of see that even though the comments header isn't visible in the visual, it's still there to denote that I have such and such comments. And what I like to point out also is if you look at this tags list definition, I have in there an unordered list of tags, but notice that I have a DD directly above it. So the DT is the title, in this case the tags. And then I have a DD with 2 tags, and then a definition containing the tags. The visual didn't have the number of tags, but I decided to add it anyway because it was more meaningful and could probably be useful later, because you can have multiple definitions for an individual title. So then I take a look at it skinless. Can you still read the information? This is what an HTML browser will render, and what the user will see with no CSS and no JavaScript. And you can see, yeah, I can read that. I don't need CSS or JavaScript to be able to understand what this definition list is. If those definition titles were missing, we might not really be able to understand everything. We might be able to infer, but to a user agent that doesn't have CSS and JavaScript, it has no idea what all this means. So then you start applying your skin. And just with simple CSS, I start removing the elements I don't need and organizing the elements I do need. And notice the posted by, for instance. So in some cases, some of that should have been turned white, but sometimes they're shown, sometimes they're not. Notice the colon is not in markup. I added that with CSS. Just because it's in the visual, I'll get to that in a minute, just because it's in the visual doesn't mean it needs to be in the browser. But what's really, really neat about definition lists as well is that a user agent for the blind will read this out as title equals video title, duration equals duration. It will actually read that text out. And so then here's an alternate skin. I threw together of the same markup and how it would look on an iPhone. And the difference in CSS here, this isn't even JavaScript, this is only CSS. The difference between these two skins is extremely minimal. We're only talking in the order of magnitude of maybe 50 lines of CSS. But if you look at the differences between them, they might as well be night and day, but they're perfect for their experience. And notice that I used the two tags element with that little arrow. I can use JavaScript now, so when they tap that, load that unordered list, slide that in, styled as well. So they could have 30 tags, tap that, and it would be perfect in the iPhone. But there's a larger point I like to make. You can write as many skins as you want, as many user experiences as you want, but shouldn't your markup be written this way anyway? I don't think anyone can come up with a reasonable reason why our markup shouldn't be meaningful in the first place, even if you don't write a second skin. But then you also can design some flexibility once you've designed your markup. So this is a tabbed container from the same page. It's a data block that visibly divides data based on a user's individual selection. So you start by ignoring the visual again. And while the visual doesn't specify in the image, there's no header for related videos. That's exactly what it is. So why not add a header that says this is 2 blocks of related videos to head that section? And since each video data block is going to be large, why don't we go ahead and create a TOC at the top of links that will actually take us down the page. So when I click more like this, it will take us to the more like this section. If I click more from this user, it will take us to the more from this user section. But that basic structure, we can actually turn into just about anything. These 3 are a couple of examples: a tab container, a cover flow, an accordion. Because in the accordion example, the item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4, those are the headers. And since in order to make that TOC at the top work, to function and take you down the page, you have to have an anchor at the top, and you actually have to surround the content of that H3 or H4, whatever it is, with an anchor, and name it. Put a name in there. All you need to do then at that point is add href equals # with JavaScript, and it suddenly becomes clickable. And then you just attach a few events. Same thing with cover flow. Each individual item, and then that TOC list of links become the little dots. So you start determining your triggers. You start saying, okay, this is the markup that I have. I have an href that takes me down the page, and then I have an anchor. But notice that JavaScript at the very bottom. It's extremely simple to decide how to show each individual section based on what link you click, because they're semantically linked together. All I have to do is get the name of the anchor I want, write a quick query selector, or use jQuery or query or whichever one you decide to use, and then write a function show that toggles the CSS. And then you just style it. I don't start with the JavaScript, I start with the style. What are these going to look like? But in this case, if they don't have JavaScript enabled, but they do have CSS, I have 2 blocks that are headed like tabs, very similar to the experience that I want. But the difference is, in this case, the tabs are the headers. Those H3s and H4, or those from the user, more like this, those become the tabs at the top of those blocks. But then if they have JavaScript, I can change that. I can add a class name to the container, step 1, and then step 2, add an event to each item in the TOC. So 1 line of JavaScript to add a class name, 1 loop to go through and attach events, and I'm done. It's an extremely small amount of code. And the only reason that's possible is because the markup is semantic and is flexible to what I needed to do. So if someone came along and said, we have too many tabs, right? It's a complaint we hear kind of often. Have too many tabs. This should be an accordion. It's extremely easy to go and change this. You literally only have to change the class name for the JavaScript enabled version and just alter the event for showing or hiding different blocks. And you just keep up with that pattern. This is an example from a project I'm working on called Proscenium. And this is two apps written in pure HTML, bundled into PhoneGap. So you can actually download this from the App Store. This is the exact same markup with roughly 75 lines of JavaScript for iPhone and 100 lines of JavaScript for WebOS. But you notice the workflows appear completely different. Whereas on the WebOS, everything is a click, everything is a step, whereas the iPhone, everything is on the surface. And it's true, this is a very simple read-only example. But I would argue you can do the same thing with forms. And these are not native, but everyone I've shown them to asks me if they are. And in a way, they are. It's just a web container. And we can talk about PhoneGap in a future example. But let me just show you briefly. This is the desktop version. So, assuming my internet connection is working. Yeah, anyway, that's why you always take screenshots. Let me see if this will work. So, thankfully I downloaded a cache. So, in this case, we just have a TOC on the left. TOC activates certain sections of content. And based on that content, this website is still functional. I can still find the items. I can still click read more. It's just flexing that CSS and JavaScript skin. And so those two apps that I wrote for iPhone and WebOS were a couple of days of work apiece. And a lot of that code ended up being reusable. And more importantly, just for grins, I threw the WebOS version into the iPhone and threw the iPhone skin into the WebOS version, just for grins. So, the big question is designers. So a lot of times people ask, how do you do rounded corners without images? Is it okay? This website, if you haven't heard of it, is do websites need to look exactly the same in every browser.com? And the answer is no. It doesn't. They don't. I would recommend everyone use the latest and greatest CSS to your heart's content. If someone gives you a hard time because the rounded corners don't look right in IE7, tough. The web is evolving. You're progressively enhancing and you're following the pattern. That's what's important. This is an example of that. This is a personal site of mine that I wrote called Backstrokes. It has a custom fulcrum. There's only one image on this whole page. And it's using HTML5 tags and CSS3. And the only image, if you can guess, is the logo on the upper left. And this functions in IE7 on. Actually, it functions in every browser, of course. But the difference is, like, IE7 doesn't have these fun little doohickeys here. And it doesn't have the fun little drop shadow on the inside. IE8 does. So maybe if I can show it, if my web. There we go. So I can come in here and I can say, okay, backstroke. One second, I have to log in. So what this does is it simply organizes your check-ins on Foursquare into trips to other cities. And allows me just to see where I went on a specific day. But if I turn off CSS, I can still see all that information. And I've added more meaningful markup to this, because markup is relatively cheap. So you can see I have a check-in count of 10 and a date range. Each individual check-in is a definition list. But you notice that in trip details, that isn't visible. But I have a feeling that when I go do the iPhone skin for this, or I go do the WebOS skin for this, that markup is going to be meaningful in that environment, but it's also meaningful for someone who's just reading this page. Does that make sense? So that's what I had planned for today. I don't have any idea how we're doing on time, but because the iPhone doesn't stay on. But I want to talk more about this, whether inside Cerner or outside Cerner. I want to help people write websites like this so we can stop hearing about, oh my gosh, I have to go redesign. The only time we should really redesign is when we have more data. So, any questions? Yes.
So from a progressive enhancement perspective, I know you incorporate a lot of AJAX calls to help, with workflows and giving that rich user experience. So how do you recommend for those sites where a lot of data is returned and you don't want to load it all up front, so you're doing it through AJAX? How do you do this and
right.
make that work?
Okay, so that's an excellent question. And just to point out, this is not the only talk that I'm going to give on this, I think. I'm going to do at least 2 more. One, how do you design workflows like that in the future? One specific, and then there's also one specifically geared towards CSS and one specifically towards JavaScript I have planned. So look forward to that in the next few months. But to answer your question, so what I've been saying all along is ignore the bolt-ons, right? And it's hard to ignore the bolt-ons sometimes. So we say, well, they click this and via AJAX the page doesn't refresh and it goes here, that, or there, or whatever. But that's exactly what you need to do, is say, okay, I have, well, actually, I can't start it up, but in the example that I just showed that had AJAX loading up individual things in that little proscenium demonstration, I actually have a version that runs on a server that when you click that link, the entire page refreshes and loads that particular section. So the long and short of it is the href for that anchor that you may load with AJAX should refresh the page no matter what. So they click that link, the whole page refreshes. But then you progressively enhance and say, okay, here is the href that I have for this anchor. When the user clicks that link, I'm going to use JavaScript to intercept that call and not refresh the page, not go somewhere else. But I'm going to take the href of that anchor, and I'm going to put it through my favorite AJAX utility. And then on my server, I'm going to look for, there's a lot of techniques for this. There's a header saying that this is an XML HTTP request. You can add an additional parameter saying this is an XML HTTP request. And that same endpoint on your server that would have refreshed the page should capture that parameter or header and convert that into a JSON object of data that's going to come back to you. And then you can use whatever means you want to. That's one way to do it. The other way is, and what we used to do, is to just return the block that you want of HTML and just drop that into the page. So that's the easiest way, is to say, okay, I'm going to go, here's my AJAX request. Don't give me the stuff around it. Just give me this one block that would have been different and drop that in. Does that make sense? Kinda. So it's kind of hard to do without a whiteboard. But let's just say Google, for instance. Well, Google's probably a bad example. Let's take Facebook. Take Facebook, for example. If you click on your events list, right, you may notice that they load up the events page, that section, via AJAX, right? They pull in just that block of HTML and drop it in that block, right? Thing is, if you don't have JavaScript and you click that link, it refreshes the page with your events list in place. So what they do is on the server, they say, this is an AJAX call. Therefore, the only thing I need to return is that block of events, and I'm going to count on the user agent to put that block of HTML in the right spot on the page. Does that make sense?
So then the existing markup's going to stay in place,
right?
Just in the cache.
Well, just depends on your architecture.
Okay.
But I would personally, I would be using something, because I'm in a JavaScript environment all the time. I'd be using Mustache or Handlebars or EJS to create partials. It just depends on your architecture. I know in MPages that you would call a different script.
Right.
It's like normally you'd be using different scripts to construct your page, you would just return that one portion of script, which would actually be faster, right?
Right.
Okay. We could talk about that. We can talk about that more.
No. Thanks, Clint.
Yeah. Any other questions?
It's less of a question, more of a comment.
Yeah.
But I've recently started using NoScript whenever I'm in Firefox, and I go to any website that I just don't, that I've never been to before. And I just want to comment that I fully support the change to, or the progression/regression of using functional HTML and then building JavaScript on top of it. Because with NoScript, if I go to a website, 99% of the time, it just won't work with all the JavaScript enabled. And I have to go through in each script and figure out which one is the one that does the function that I want to use. And some websites, I still can't figure it out unless I have all scripts enabled all the time. The website just doesn't work at all. I'd rather have an ugly website that works than a pretty one that doesn't.
Thanks for that. That's exactly right. Because, and the other thing that unless you wrap all of your JavaScript with a try-catch, you can ruin your experience. I don't remember exactly who is the website that did this, but it might have been Gizmodo. I don't know. They used hash banks. Kind of a long discussion of what hash banks are. They used hash banks to load their content, and they pushed a version of their website that the JavaScript was broken, and their entire site was blank for days because they miscalculated in their JavaScript. And that's the danger you run into, is you not only do you assume that the user agent has JavaScript, you also assume all your JavaScript code is first of all yours, right? Because we don't use ads in our environment, but if we were to build a website that supported ads, we have to trust that someone else has written JavaScript code that won't break. Because if JavaScript fails, if any call in JavaScript fails, all interpretation of JavaScript after that stops. So if your ad code or your broken code is your first script, anything else you had after that doesn't exist. So this has more implications than just let's reuse code. In my opinion, this is the right way to build websites. Thank you for that.
Hey, Clint, back on your example where you're building the video with the markup a bit. This is very, I don't know enough about HTML, but I noticed that you had inside of your markup there's like spans and divs inside of your definition list. What is the purpose of those? Because it seems like those are
extraneous.
Yeah.
Okay, this is just from my personal experience. In this particular instance, DTs and DDs can be a little hard to style sometimes. And so I assume that since DTs, the text is always, since in my design the title was going to, or the DT was always going to be text, and I wasn't sure what was going to go in the DD, whether it's a thumbnail or if it's another video, like related videos and having a stack of videos. Since I wasn't sure if that was going to be a Flash object or what it was going to be, I chose to wrap those in an additional element simply for convenience. I mean, I'm not adding like 6 or 7. Sometimes you do want to add just something to make sure that you're not blowing up your DD with a huge list of stuff. So, but yeah, in that instance, that's why I did that. Any other questions or comments? You can tell me I'm crazy. Who said that? Well, thanks guys for coming. I appreciate it. And again, if anyone has any questions, or I always love to see discussions around semantics. One of the greatest things is when you use HTML quite often, you get you tend to have long philosophical debates, arguments, drag out fist fights about what the right element is. I always love to hear those types of debates, because it means that people are thinking about what tags they're using. There's always more than one answer, right? Definition lists are great, but these could also have been headed sections if the content was larger. These DTs could have easily turned into H4s with a paragraph or a div following. So it just depends on your individual use case and what your team thinks and what you think. So anyway, thanks, appreciate it. Sorry I wasn't at DevCon. I heard I was roundly made fun of at some point, I think, maybe. But anyway, thanks. Appreciate it.